In this video, we're going to start talking about behavior in a social context. So we're starting to move into the idea of social psychology, where we consider the fact that humans are social creatures, and we live in environments where we interact with others, and those interactions with others can in turn start shaping our behavior. We're going to start by talking about something called attribution. So an attribution is just a judgment about the cause of our own or other people's behavior and outcomes. Basically, you can attribute some kind of outcome to some underlying factor. So you could ask yourself, did this particular event happen because of reason X or because of reason Y? So we can use the example of, did I get an A on this test because I'm really smart? Or is it because the test was easy? The first attribution, the idea that I got an A because I'm really smart, is a personal attribution. So I am giving myself credit. And that attribution, that idea there, can shape our subsequent behavior and emotion. Maybe I'm going to feel pride. I'm proud of myself for having done really well on that test. The second attribution that we had there was the idea that I got the A because the test was easy. That's a situational attribution. I'm attributing my success to the situation. The test itself was easy, so my success had nothing to do with me, and it's all based on the environment. So maybe instead of feeling proud about my own success, maybe I feel a little bit cheated. Maybe I feel disappointed because the test was really easy, so the grade doesn't mean as much. So depending on how we decide to frame this, depending on what we're attributing that outcome to, it can change our behavior and our emotions, how we're going to feel about a situation, and how we can react to that situation. Especially when we're trying to interpret or explain the behavior of others, we might talk about those internal explanations as something that is dispositional or trait-based. So we might say that if we're looking at the behavior of our coworker Jane, she's late for work. Our internal explanation or dispositional explanation might be based on the fact that Jane is irresponsible, so it is something based on her specific trait. Or we might say that it's external or situational, something caused by environmental situations, and we might say, no, she's late because Jane is stuck in traffic, something outside of her control. A psychologist named Harold Kelly proposed that there are 3 different factors that can help us determine whether we should make a personal or a situational attribution for someone else's behavior. And these factors are listed here in this chart. So the first of these is consistency, the second distinctiveness, and the third is consensus. And we're going to walk through an example to illustrate what each of these factors mean and how we could employ them. So consider that you have a friend, and the textbook uses Kim as the name for that friend. So your friend Kim says that a particular class, Art 391, is boring. So that's the behavior, is that they've told you that this class is boring. You shouldn't take the class because it's boring. Now, if you're trying to attribute this behavior, if you're trying to decide if this is something that is personal or situational, if you're trying to decide if Kim is overly critical and maybe the class isn't actually that bad, or if this is situational and the class is actually boring, you can evaluate those 3 factors to decide how to attribute this. So for consistency, if you have high consistency, we would say that every time you ask your friend about this class, they're going to say that the class is boring. So it's not that this person is inconsistent in their opinion. There's high consistency, so they always think that the class is boring. We'll actually see high consistency most of the time. So that doesn't really help us decide if it's a personal or a situational attribution, but it does give us an idea what it means to be high consistency, so we'll go with it. Our next factor that we want to evaluate is distinctiveness. Is this statement that this particular class typical of this person? Or is this distinct? Is this different from what she usually says? So at the top here, for low distinctiveness, if Kim says that all of her classes are boring, then maybe that's just a Kim thing, and she thinks that all of her classes are boring. So that doesn't really tell you anything about this situation, about this particular class. So that's low distinctiveness. In contrast, high distinctiveness would be that Kim says that only this one particular class is boring. If she says that all of her other classes are interesting and this one course is boring, then that's starting to give you the idea that, well, maybe it's not just that Kim thinks everything is boring. Maybe there's something about this particular class. So this is giving us a little bit more evidence towards a situational attribution, whereas low distinctiveness is getting us towards that personal attribution. Now for our last factor here, we have consensus. So what does this one person's behavior or actions have in common with other people? So if we have low consensus, if all of the other students that you've talked to say that this one class is great, then you have low consensus because the person we're trying to evaluate says that it's boring, but everyone else says it's great. So that makes us think that it isn't so much the class as maybe the person. So that high consistency, low distinctiveness, and low consensus leads us towards a more personal attribution, where we would conclude that your friend, Kim, is overly critical. Other students say that the class is great. Kim says all of her classes are boring, and so we think that maybe this decision, this statement that this particular class is boring isn't so much about the class itself, but it's about the person who's deciding that it's boring to them. So that's the personal attribution. On the other hand, if we go back to the bottom here and talk about high consensus, if everyone that you talk to says that this class is boring, then maybe it isn't just Kim, it's that the class itself is actually boring. So if we go along this bottom line, we're saying high consistency, high distinctiveness, and high consensus. We're saying that, yeah, it's probably the class because this one individual says that it's boring. This is the only class that they've singled out as being boring, and everyone agrees that it's boring, then yeah, it's probably the class. So we end up with a situational attribution. So if we wanted to break it down, if we have a situational attribution, if we've decided that it's probably the situation and not the person, then we're probably seeing high scores for all three of our attributional factors: high consistency, high distinctiveness, and high consensus. Whereas if we have a personal attribution, you're probably going to be seeing high consistency, but low everything else, low consensus and low distinctiveness. So that's how you're going to usually assign personal or situational attribution, at least according to Kelly's theory. But by now, you should probably know that it isn't as simple as that. We're humans, and we have lots of biases, and this isn't an exception to that rule. So we tend to display what's called a fundamental attribution error, which basically says that when we're trying to explain other people's behavior, we tend to underestimate the impact of situational factors and overestimate the role of personal factors. So we're a lot more likely to say that something is going on because of that person. We're attributing it to a personal factor, as opposed to attributing it to a situational factor. There was a really cool experiment that had looked at this, where
they had university students read a speech that was either for or against the current Cuban president, Fidel Castro, time. And so they were told, these university students were told that this pro or anti-Castro speech was written by a member of the university debate team. They then asked these university students to rate whether the person who had written the speech was pro or anti-Castro. Now, the cool part, actually we can flip over to the graph here showing the results, was that in half of the cases, the students were told that the person who wrote the speech was able to choose whether they argued for or against Fidel Castro. And so if we look at this graph here, we're looking at a scale of sort of higher being pro-Castro and lower being anti-Castro. And for our group where the students were told that the person who wrote the speech had chosen their topic, we see that the ones who chose to write a pro-Castro speech were rated as being very pro-Castro, and the ones that chose to write an anti-Castro speech were very anti-Castro, and that's totally fine. But where it gets cool is that when the university students were told that their perspective was assigned rather than chosen, meaning that they had been told they had to write a speech that was pro or anti-Castro, we still see that the university students rated the people that wrote a pro-Castro speech as being more pro-Castro than the ones who wrote an anti-Castro speech, even when they were supposedly assigned that topic, which would be a situational attribution. The assumption being that if you were assigned, then that's the situation. You didn't choose to be pro or anti anything. There shouldn't be any personal attribution. And yet we do see quite a bit of assumed personal attribution there. So even when they had this extra information that the role was assigned to these speechwriters, the situational information was ignored. So this is fairly typical of this fundamental attribution error, and in a lot of cases we see that this underestimation of situational factors and overestimation of personal factors carries across lots and lots of different situations. Now, it's kind of cool to note that this fundamental attribution error applies to others, but not to ourselves. So the textbook uses the example of when you're driving, the person in front of you who's driving too slowly is annoying. They're slow and shouldn't be driving. But the person behind you who's driving quickly and tries to pass you is a maniac. And yet when you're in that situation where you're the one who's driving slowly and someone's trying to pass you, or when you're trying to pass someone else, you never think of yourself as slow and shouldn't be driving or a maniac. So the idea here is we have more information about ourselves. We can think about and understand our own attributions, but we have to make some assumptions when trying to make attributions that apply to others. The idea is that others are going to be a figure, so someone who's standing out from the background. So when you're watching someone else's behavior, they're your entire focus. But when we're behaving, we're not watching ourselves at that same level. Instead, we would consider ourselves the background. We're silent in our own scenario. So we're not really focusing on ourselves in the same way that we focus in on others when they're behaving. But again, the cool part is if you were forced to watch your own behavior remotely, so say someone showed you a video recording of your own behavior, then you might start applying this fundamental attribution error to yourself, where you start assuming more personal attributions and fewer situational attributions to your own actions. But only when you're forced to focus on yourself, to treat yourself as a figure, rather than having your own actions occur in the background. Now, this could be kind of depressing, where this kind of error of attribution, where we assume that everything is personally attributed and not so much situationally driven, it's kind of sad to think about. But this error isn't inevitable. If people are given enough time to think and reflect and work through these different considerations, they can actually reduce that error. So there's less of that biased attribution to personal factors and ignoring situational factors. So with time, we can learn to understand that there are situational factors involved and that those could be driving particular behaviors, which is a good thing. For some other attributional biases or errors, we also find that people tend to assume that actors have traits of characters that they have played. So we have the example here of Leonard Nimoy, who played the logical and emotionless Vulcan Mr. Spock from Star Trek. A lot of people, when they met Leonard Nimoy, assumed that he was logical and cold, just like his character was. But they couldn't realize that as a person, he was separate and different from the character that he played. So we have quite a few of these fundamental errors in our attributions, just because of how we tend to think about different scenarios. Another facet of this bias comes when we're trying to explain our own behaviors. Kind of like I said before, when you think of your own actions, you don't have the same type of bias as you do when evaluating others' actions. And we can actually see something called a self-serving bias, which is where we tend to have more personal attributions for our successes. Like, I did really well on this test because I'm really smart and I studied really hard and I did a good job. But you'll see more situational attributions for our failures. So I failed this test because it was a really hard test, because somebody else distracted me or something else happened that caused me to fail. Now, the degree that we'll see this difference in attributions will depend strongly on our culture and even on our psychological state. So people who are prone to depression or who are currently feeling depressed end up having more personal attributions for their failures than non-depressed people will. So people who have depression are going to see their failures as their own personal shortcomings and are less likely to blame it on a situation, which we're not sure if that's leading to their depression or because of their depression, but the two things tend to happen together. And on the cultural side of things, we would see that individualistic cultures, so more Western cultures, have that personal attribution, especially for success, to be a little bit higher. And that kind of makes sense, where an individualistic culture would focus more on the individual and attribute different behaviors to their personal status. In contrast, more collectivistic cultures, cultures that are viewing as a group, they think of things as a whole and less as an individual. They would take more responsibility for their failures, but also have a situational attribution for successes. So in some East Asian cultures, you'll see a more complex, holistic view of behavioral causes, and less like the straight self-serving bias that we associate with Western cultures. But there's lots of noise when looking at culture and cultural influences in terms of attributions.